Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a doof media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, constant reader Scott Daly, and I'm joined, as always, by the frequently dividing slime monster. His name is Matt Freeman. How's it going today, Matt?
Oh, pretty good, Scott. I've got my case of beer here that I'm going to slurp down over the course of this podcast.
Did you ever think about not drinking the beer?
Never occurred to me.
This week on the show, our coverage of Stephen King's Night Shift continues with 5 more short stories. This week we'll be chatting about Gray Matter, Battleground, Trucks, Sometimes They Come Back, and lastly, Strawberry Spring. Matt, this is a very interesting project we've set ourselves up on because this collection of stories in particular is such an odd one in that I think the first 3 are kind of just silly, fun joke stories. And then the 4th one is like super serious, dealing with trauma, horrifying and depressing. And we have to cover all of this in the course of one episode.
Yeah, it is really hard for me, because normally for years what we've practiced doing is taking one little piece of a really big story and really digging into it. And this is like a torture device invented by Satan, because it's you have to go through several whole stories and somehow do justice to all of them in the same amount of time that we normally would talk about, like the time that Jack Torrance scratched his ear and sat on a roof for a while.
Yeah, and not only that, stories with disparate tones and goals, and it is certainly a challenge for us.
It is.
I'm enjoying the challenge, but like preparing this week's notes was like I was blazing through it. You know, I didn't write that much for Battleground. I didn't write that much for Trucks, and then we got to Sometimes They Come Back, and I just I stopped. I think I took a day break and came back to the notes a day later. It was just like, all right, I need to get my head around how to approach this as compared to those other stories.
You need to change gears. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I will say though that I am really enjoying this, and I love. This is just reminding me how much I love short stories, because like there's just something about them where, you know, I can vividly remember details of short stories that I read 20 years ago. There's something about the medium that does that. I just love it.
Yeah, I mean, there's like we're going to talk about this a lot more with our discussion question at the end of today's episode, but there's like a flattening that happens to all stories that you read over time, right? Where you forget more and more of the details. And so you're just left with the big moments and the big feelings of the story. And the thing about short stories is all that's compressed. So that the big moments and the big feelings that the story have are basically the entire story. Yeah. And so you just have a better memory of the story as a whole over time as you get further and further away from them.
I agree. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. And I am with you on this. I'm loving these. It's great. It's a lot of fun. I was re-listening to last week's episode and our wonderful coverage of the Mangler, and you could tell how much fun we were having with that one. And I knew going into that one that we had these stories coming up, and I was like, oh boy, this is going to be a good time.
Yeah, I agree. These, I think I overall liked this week's reading more than last week's reading, to be honest.
I would say that's fair. Yeah. Speaking of things with multiple stories that we had to cover in one episode, our episode on Other Levels of the Tower, our bonus podcast on Patreon, came out today as we sit here to record this, and it was on Stephen King and George Romero's Creepshow, the 1982 anthology film that we watched and talked about. And I think, we both really love that movie, right, Matt? And it's a really great conversation, I think.
Yeah, it took me off guard with how much I enjoyed it. And and it very much did seem to be working the same muscles as these conversations about short stories.
Yeah.
In fact,
it's almost as if I planned it that way.
It's almost as if you cleverly planned it. And then by the way, I had no awareness that you had like done it this way on purpose. It was just like, oh, it's an anthology. Hey, Scott, this is kind of like the short stories that we're covering. Yes,
no.
Matt.
Yeah, I also like accidentally published that episode incorrectly on Patreon, so everyone who's a patron has access to it. normally we only do our folks at a certain tier or higher. So apologies if you're at that tier or higher and furious at me. I'm sorry. I'll happily give you a refund. But if you're lower that tier, you get a cool bonus episode that you can listen to right now, and maybe you'll want to listen to more later.
Yeah.
It was not. I wish I could say I did that intentionally, but it was just very late last night when I published the episode, and I checked the wrong box.
Yeah, well, lucky all of you out there.
Yeah. Also, Matt, a weird thing. There's a story in that thing about bugs, and we had a long conversation on that episode about how creepy it is to feel bugs crawling over you. And I'm sitting here today, the day this episode came out, typing away at my computer, and I look down, and there's just a spider crawling along my forearm, just having a time, and it was like the most uncomfortable thing in the world. I freaked out. Not only because there's a bug on me and it's a spider, and my brain immediately goes, "Is this a poisonous spider?" Probably not. But and then the second thing my brain did was like, "Oh my god, it's like that movie." And so I killed it. I killed the spider. It's dead. I also messed up my mouse because I slammed down so hard.
Well, I'm sorry about all of that. It is kind of freaky because, like, how many times in a person's life do they suddenly have a bug on them? You know,
not often.
Not often. Maybe it's happened to me a couple times in my life, and this happens to you the day after we have the conversation about how creepy it would be to have a bug on you. I don't know, man. That's I don't like it. I don't like it.
It's Ka. That's the only explanation.
It's like the bad kind of Ka, though. It's not the serendipity kind of Ka. It's the like, oh shit kind of Ka.
And then suddenly they were crawling out of the vents and in my bed. And like the thing that happened is, you know, like the times you do see bugs or experience bugs crawling on you, and then like every movement of your arm hair from then on out is like a thing that your body normally just completely ignores. But now it's going to pay attention to every single one. So like for literally the rest of the day, I constantly felt like I had things crawling over my arms.
Yep.
Not fun.
Sounds about right.
So for that kind of conversation and more, tune in to our episode on Creepshow, available now on Patreon.
Yep.
All right, Matt, let's get into it. We have 5 stories to discuss today. Our first one is Gray Matter. The story was first published in the 1973 issue of Cavalier magazine. I think the majority of the stories this week and as a whole in this book were originally published in Cavalier. So that magazine and King really got along there.
Yeah, that's cool to know.
I wonder, Matt, beginning the story, whether someone has like collected and collated the data and the math on just how many Stephen King stories begin with a bunch of people sitting around a store drinking and then plot comes crashing in. Because like I feel like that happens twice in this week's reading alone and more in this collection as a whole. And like this is obviously one of those stories. I feel like it just happens a lot. It's like the setting. Like that's how The Stand opened, right? There's a bunch of guys just sitting around a general store drinking, and oh look, plot, it's here.
That's hilarious. Yeah, you're right. It's probably like a third of his works, honestly, and I don't really have any complaints because it does seem like a good way of setting the scene. You get the opportunity to introduce a lot of characters efficiently. Yeah, I see why he does it, you know, for all the fact that it is kind of funny that it is a motif that shows up over and over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I'm not complaining either. I think it's a remarkably effective way to start a story. It's just, I really noticed this week that, man, so many of these stories are like this.
Yeah, no, you're right.
So, gosh, this is such an interesting little story here, Matt, where King is, I think, once again using the paranormal to discuss ideas like, for example, abusive, terrible, shitty fathers who turn into monsters. So here at the beginning of the story, we meet our cast of characters, including our narrator, Henry, the owner, our narrator, and I believe the narrator in this one goes unnamed. I'm not sure about that, but they do a lot. Then we also meet Henry, the owner of the store, and there's an abusive dad and a poor child. It's once again we're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, so we already mentioned Creepshow and the fact that we just watched that, obviously, but I think it's probably going to come up more in this conversation as we go through these stories, because like I see a lot of the same sensibilities here. Like we had the idea of an abusive dad,
Yeah.
and we had the idea of a dude transforming into another thing because of a supernatural thing that happened in Creepshow also. So I'm just putting a pin in that because, like, I mean, don't you agree, right? Pretty direct comparisons
Oh
to be
yeah.
made between this story and the Meteor story
Oh yeah.
in
Oh yeah.
Creepshow. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the reason for that is simply these are things that King thinks about a lot, and these are things that he wants to explore a lot. And as he said in the foreword of this book, these are things that horror is especially astute and skilled at really examining. And so here we have this weird story that is also very clearly a metaphor for how alcohol can turn a person into a monster.
Yeah. I love that. We'll talk about that,
Mhm.
of course. Yeah.
I love this anecdote. You know, we're as we said, our characters are just sitting around the store drinking. We're kind of meeting them very quickly here, and we get this anecdote about Henry, who we learn has been letting an almost blind man shoplift bread from him for years. Once a week, he comes in, steals a loaf of bread, and leaves. And Henry knows about it and lets it happen. And I love this. So we get this line here. Bertie once asked Henry why he never put a stop to it. I'll tell you, Henry said. A few years back, the Air Force wanted $20 million to rig up a flying model of an airplane they had planned out. Well, it cost them $75 million, and the damn thing wouldn't fly. That happened 10 years ago when Blind Eddie and myself were considerably younger, and I voted for the woman who sponsored that bill. Blind Eddie voted against her, and since then, I've been buying his bread.
So I mean, the joke here is just that he's almost like making amends for voting for the wrong person, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not that complicated. It's just funny that it's just a funny idea, right? It's just a little bite of kind of the types of shenanigans that you can imagine these old timers hanging around the small town would get up to. And it's just great characterization and makes it feel like this, real group of people. It's
Yeah.
really good stuff.
And Henry is really the character in this story doing a lot of the heavy lifting, right? You know, our narrator is there, but he's kind of standing back and observing. Henry's the one really driving the action. And so it makes sense that King spends the most amount of time really getting us to understand this. And I think this little anecdote goes a far way for us to understand what type of person he is, because he's that type of person. He's the type of person that can admit when they're wrong, cares about other people. Like, I think a lot of this is going towards getting us to understand why this kid is going to come in his store, is going to tell him a story, and even if he doesn't fully believe the story yet, he's going to hitch up his posse and go check it out. Really, no questions asked, type thing.
I mean, you've just done everything except actually verbally state that he is the gunslinger in this scenario. Because he is. And by the way, while we're making connections, I can't help but notice, his name is Henry, and he let Blind Eddie take the loaf of bread. So we've got Henry and Eddie, which are,
there you go.
There's a little more than a commonality of name here. It's not like there's a strong reference being made, but I guess King likes certain names.
Yeah, he does, and I think we can have fun with that because obviously in the author's mind, Henry and Eddie didn't exist yet, but he used those names again, and once again we see Henry and Eddie linked. I love it.
Yeah.
So in through the storm bursts our plot in the form of Timmy Grenadine, who has been coming to the store lately. We learn to buy beer for his drunken fool of a father, Richie. Only this time when he comes in, he looks terrified of something, and we don't really know what yet.
I think the description and portrayal of his terror are really great and authentic.
I agree. Yeah.
Something that King's always good at.
Mm-hmm. And this is one of those interesting King structural touches that really fascinate me, and it's why I want to spend some time on it here, because basically the way the plot unfolds here is Timmy bursts in through the door. He, to ostensibly to buy beer and bring it to Richie, but also he's terrified and afraid, and he needs help with something. Henry takes Timmy into the back room to tell him the story of what's going on with his father, and we, through the lens of our narrator, who is just a side party sitting in the store, don't get to hear that story. We're not privileged to that story. It's happening out of the room. But then Henry comes out saying they need to go take the beer to Richie and has this worried look on his face. He also brings his gun. And then and only then, when Henry has round up his quartet and are going to Richie's apartment, then are we relayed the story that Timmy told Henry, which is interesting, right? Because you could see a version of this thing where, Timmy busts in the door and he tells every guy sitting there what's going on with his father. But King adds an extra step to it. We relay it to one single person, and then that single person relays it to the rest of the people, including us. And that's really interesting, right? Because that's a choice.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what it does is it hooks us, makes us curious. We don't know what's going on, but we want to know what's going on. And then that pulls us along deeper into the story, and King kind of drip feeds us the details past that point. It's I think he's always thinking about the hook, right? He's thinking about that's why he so often does the thing where he kind of spoils what's going to happen for you later. Is he's only spoiling just enough to hook you. He's not spoiling the details that you really crave. And here he didn't really do that. He didn't spoil the ending, but he did give us a different sort of hook, which was like, oh my God, this kid saw something terrifying. What is it? We don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to find out. That's very up his alley, I think.
And just the central idea that the kid has told someone but not us is almost even more like you're pulled into a little bit more. It's like, oh, somebody knows, and so this is a story that's being told and we're just not privileged to it yet. Well, that drives me crazy. I need to know.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And then also it allows him to do this thing where Henry comes out and is like, I don't know. I'll tell you the rest later, but check out these dollar bills. And like the dollars are just covered with this gray slimy stuff that Henry now knows what that represents. But again, we don't. And so we get to play this mysterious, like, what's up with the gray slimy dollar bills? That's weird.
Yeah. It's just another hook, right? It's a hook and it's a clue to prime us.
Yeah. Yeah. So as they walk in the cold to Richie's house, we finally get the story that Henry was told. One night, Richie drank himself a bad can of beer. I love this little anecdote here that to get us, the reader, to understand how this could possibly happen, that Richie consumes beer so quickly that the idea that he would drink 3/4 of a can that smelled and tasted like death before he even realized it is completely believable, actually. That's just one of those good old bar story type things that just work perfectly, I think.
Yeah. Happens to the best of us.
Yeah. So he swallows this horribly skunked monster beer that turns him into a slime monster.
So
and that's Matt, kind of the rest of the story, right? At least the story within the story, that through Timmy's eyes we see the deterioration and destruction of his father, which, as we said, is once again King writing about parents and specifically fathers, and specifically the ways in which fathers are destroyed by alcohol abuse. I like this really interesting thing that besides just turning into a gray mucousy blob monster, what the effect of this thing is that it just turns his alcoholism up to 11, right? He doesn't leave the house. He's got all the shades drawn. He sits on the couch all day and watches TV and just drinks and drinks and drinks. It's the stuff he was doing already, just turned up.
Yeah. And to extend the metaphor further, right? Like the disease, which is now this gray goo, feeds on the beer. He seems to, he demands it because it's like, I mean, just, the hand wave, like the sugars or whatever in the beer are what the goo needs to grow.
Sure. Yeah.
And, but also obviously, like you just pointed out, it works as the metaphor where it's like, well, that's his disease. And his disease must be fed by the alcohol, but it also makes him worse, and it takes over his life. And then by the end of the story, we see that he starts to do horrible things, and he becomes totally monstrous and inhuman. Then there's also the element where the son keeps trying to kind of help him and cover for him, and it's kind of out of love and kind of out of fear and kind of not wanting to admit how bad the problem has gotten, right? Like it takes his dad like visibly turning into a giant slug for him to really realize that things have gotten too bad for him to cover for anymore. So
Yeah.
and I love all of that because like it's again reminds me so much of our creep show conversation, because it's this incredibly difficult mix of poignancy and bizarre horror that almost borders on the comedic.
Yeah.
Because like we talked about this on Creep Show, like the idea that you're going to turn into a goo monster because you drank a bad beer is a silly idea.
Uh-huh.
Some of the other ideas in this week's episode are silly ideas, but like it's played so straight, and the like the reality of the suffering of the characters involved is so authentic that it just sits in this weird place in your mind where it's this balance between like the bizarre like dark comedy of it and the actual pathos of it.
You're so right, and that's again one of the things that I think is unique to short story. Like, I don't think you could maintain a thing like this in a longer length story. This weird mixture of absurd silliness, but also we're touching on very complicated, very sad themes at times, like the ways in which alcohol can destroy people. I don't think that would work. I think it works specifically because this is like a 10-page story where you get in, you see the absurdity, and the story works on you because you're kind of chuckling along while also kind of feeling bad for the kid at the same time, or maybe not even consciously feeling bad for the kid because the tone of the story is so silly, but it just you buy into a little bit more because of the metaphor that's at the bottom of this thing.
I like that. I do wonder if some of the novels of Kings that have been less well received, like Tommyknockers or Needful Things, are trying to do this thing, and because it's in a long form narrative, that's part of why they're not as well received.
That's an interesting question. I wouldn't be confident enough to definitively conclude on that without visiting those with that idea in mind.
Sure.
But no, I like that line of thinking for sure.
Yeah, it just occurred to me. Something to think about.
Yeah. But as you kind of hinted toward, things continue to escalate, and eventually Richie is more lump than man, more slug than human, and then he eats the cat, which is just really, it's the final straw when you eat the cat, which is what gets Timmy to run to Henry and ask for help.
That's what I always say.
So the story told, they're finally there to deliver Richie his beer. I like that, like throughout all, and this is part of what the absurdity of the story is that throughout all of this, they're still holding up the pretense that what they're really just doing there is bringing Richie some more beer.
Yeah. It's very strange. Yeah.
Like they knock on the door. I was like, "Got your beer for you, Richie," and he's just like, "Slide it under the door."
Yeah.
It's just absurd. It really is. But I love how, speaking of this mixture of silly and creepy, I love the way in which King sets up the atmosphere as they walk into the building, right? Like it reeks, it smells horribly, it's hot, and it just, all this atmospheric stuff, all the literal atmospheric stuff helps create the atmosphere of the scene. And it just kind of builds and builds and builds and builds until the door bursts out and we get our first good look at Richie the Slug Man.
Yeah. So I just have to say, like, for all that we've been talking about how this is kind of campy and silly, like the descriptions of him being a gross slug man and his glorfing around his apartment and like all of that is actually pretty creepy to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's the kind of thing that I imagine it and I kind of shudder a little bit, more so than some other things that I imagine. Like I complained last week a little bit about how like it's just not that creepy to me to imagine rats doing things. I'm just like, sure. I'm picturing rats and I'm feeling nothing. But like I picture like a man who is like transformed into a drippy, slimy, quivering blob of human jelly. That's like unnerving to me in a way that I kind of feel more viscerally. for whatever reason. I think different people just have different buttons, right? Maybe that's one of my
Yeah,
buttons.
definitely. I get that. And I mean, I think I'm a little different than you in this, and not like I I agree that this thing was gross, but like I don't know, like this description here, it was like a huge gray wave of jelly that looked like a man and leaving a trail of slime behind it. But that wasn't the worst. Its eyes were flat and yellow and wild, with no human soul in them. Only there wasn't two, there were four. And right down the center of the thing, betwixt the two pairs of eyes, was a white fibrous line with a kind of pulsing pink flesh showing through like a slit in a hog's belly. It was dividing, you see, dividing in two. Like that's wonderfully written and it's disgusting, but I kind of look at that as like a, ew, I like it. Like it's wonderfully gross to me. Whereas the rat stuff to me was like actually like, oh, like that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, no, this kind of reminds me of like we'll be talking about like violent movies sometimes, and I'll be like, yeah, I remember when like the Predator did the thing with the shield and split the guy's head off with the shield, and it's like that was awesome. It's like that's definitely a kind of weird reaction that I have because I was raised on violent action movies, and I actually just pointing out that people react to things differently is totally 100%. What we're aiming for here, and worth noting, I guess, especially when you're going through a whole bunch of stories really quickly, and it's like the reasons why some of these stories might have worked particularly well or particularly not well can be very like idiosyncratically personal, and it's just like it's just you can't argue one way or the other, right? It's not you're not wrong. It's just like it didn't work for me for some reason, you know.
And there's just this is why I love short stories, because there's just so little time investment that you can just be like,
yeah.
Like I've never, and this might not be true. I'm about to say a very broad generic statement, but I've never met someone that just hated a short story. You know, like even if you don't like it, even if the story didn't work on you, I don't think I could ever have an emotional reaction, a negative emotional reaction to that level of hatred, because it's like, yeah, I didn't like this one, but it took me like 20 minutes to read. And so, whatever, moving on.
Yeah, I will say I get mad at short stories that are clearly written just to like make you feel bad. But I don't think I think I basically agree with your assertion that it's like, well, okay, and then I went on with my day. I didn't devote several days to it, you know.
Yeah. So the story ends with our narrator running away back to the safety of Henry's store. He's sitting there waiting, he's thinking about how quickly exponential reproduction works, and then the story kind of ends with us not knowing if Henry managed to kill Richie or if Richie managed to kill Henry, and if the world is about to come to an end or not, which is a fun little cliffhangery ending, right?
Yeah. Honestly, if I ever find Stephen King's car driven off the road in the snow and I drag him back to my cabin and nurse him back to health, what I'm going to be asking him to write is the ending of the story, because I want to know what happens to Henry.
Really? Really?
Just that, and then I'll just let him go.
I actually want to do a remake of Misery, except it's that, and it's like one obscure short story that the author wrote 57 years ago.
Yeah,
and you're like, their reaction is like, what?
That one?
Really?
You don't want me to like change the way I did the Dark Tower?
You don't want more of the clown?
No,
this is the one you want.
It's just more gray matter. Okay. Can do that, I guess.
In this hypothetical situation, like it's almost worth like just seeing King's reaction to, I need to know what happens at the end of Gray Matter. There's a good chance that it will take him a few seconds to remember that he wrote a story named Gray Matter.
I think you're probably right.
No, but I mean, it is. This is another thing that short stories can get away with, right? There's no resolution here, right? There's, we don't know if Henry's dead. We don't know if Richie's dead. We don't know what's going to happen to any of our characters or the entire world. And that's okay. We just move on.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's only something that a 10-page story could get away with.
I agree.
Which moves us on to our second story of the week, Battleground, first published in the September 1972 issue of Cavalier magazine. And Matt, I don't know if I want to spend too much time on this story. It's fun. I enjoy it. It's a fun story about a hitman getting his ass kicked by a bunch of G.I. Joes. It's great, but that's pretty much all it is. I don't know. What do you think about this one?
Yeah, it's another one of those so-called writer ones where it's like it's a fun, interesting premise that doesn't really deserve a full story. It deserves about as many words as he gives to it. It's fun, like you said. You know, you can hardly really critique it because it's like it's kind of exactly as long as it needs to be, and you enjoy it and you put it down. And I guess like the only other thing that jumps out to me about it is that there's like, in an almost John Wick fashion, there's like a gesturing at like a larger world of assassins and intrigue that is only vaguely implied by certain things that our protagonist thinks. And like maybe it's related to the shop, who knows, but it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter at all. It's just the setting, just the set dressing for this ridiculous scenario.
I mean, it's Toy Story, but they can murder you.
Yeah.
It's great. That's great.
Yeah.
So our protagonist, Renshaw, is back from a job murdering the head of a toy company. He finds a footlocker filled with toy soldiers, weapons, and aircraft in his apartment, and they all happen to be alive. They attack him, and they eventually end up detonating a nuclear weapon to defeat him. And that's the story.
Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah.
But I do in this one, Matt, find the writing very fun here. Like watching as this guy just slowly gets chopped up by these very determined little soldiers. I like the slow dawning realization of like, I'm losing, and like the idea where he kind of gets unhinged enough to run out and jump out of his bathroom window to climb around the ledge of his penthouse apartment to get to flank the little tiny toy soldiers. It's really delightful. It really is.
Well, you know what? One little note that I ended up loving when I thought back about it is that the first thing he thinks when he opens the box, or when he begins to open the box, is he thinks it was a bomb, and then the text is like, well, he didn't know that it was a bomb, but you always started out treating these things like they were a bomb because that was the attitude that kept you alive. And then the irony is, it is a bomb.
It is a bomb.
It is the bomb. So what you just said about like him getting completely desperate, that to me was the fun part of the story. Is like despite the fact that it was silly, it actually worked on me. Like as the feeling of how things started to get away from him, where it's like, oh, okay, little toy soldiers, I can handle that, and then suddenly one thing goes wrong, and then suddenly there's another curveball. And then suddenly he's on the back foot. And before you know it, he's like, oh shit, I don't actually know how I'm going to get out of this situation. Like that's the horror of the situation. This like escalation of the feeling of loss of control and realizing the situation is worse than you thought. And that actually worked on me. Like not joking. I was like, oh my God, like that this is actually tense. Like I'm worried, like I'm feeling emotions about the silly toy soldiers story, which, you know, great. It's great stuff.
No, you're so right, because I think this story plays on the idea that every person reading it is probably their initial reaction is, these are fucking inch tall toys. I could take them.
Yeah.
I could take them. And so you're going into it with that mindset, which is the same mindset the character has. And then you see him lose in, I think, a believable way, in the ways in which he's underestimating them or just getting outplayed by them is believable. And that allows the tension to pull you through everything, including, you know, going out on your ledge and shuffling against the side of a really tall building just to sneak up behind a footlocker of toy soldiers and chuck a Molotov cocktail into it.
Which was going to burn down his apartment building at best. Right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. The other thing I do like, speaking of Stephen King and his humor, like the first time we see them use a rocket launcher against him,
Uh-huh.
Renshaw's reaction to that is, damn it, that wasn't even listed on the box. As if that's the thing he's upset about.
Yeah.
Is that the living toy soldier locker did not properly list all pieces, and there's a clever joke that King uses that for at the very 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 end of the story. But I just love that that's the reaction that he has to this. It's like, that no fair, that wasn't on the list of things that it said you had.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it made sense that he started the story with this kind of framing as like this guy is part of a league of borderline supernatural assassins, possibly. So the idea of receiving a box full of animated toy soldiers is possibly he sees this kind of thing all the time. It's hard to say. He doesn't explicitly say that this is just another Tuesday for him, but also he manages to keep his cool and not really overreact to the bizarreness of the situation, which makes him in some ways a more fun protagonist for this story than he would be if he spent the whole story being like, what the hell is going on? Anyway, yeah, I don't know. I guess the reason I bring that up is like, it's, despite the fact that it's a very silly idea, there's a lot of subtle, clever choices that were made to actually make it still work. Like, for example, the choice of how the protagonist is situated.
No, I agree. I totally agree. And the one really thing that I think is the most interesting and possibly one of the keys to unlocking the story is that we do learn that this is specifically, the text goes out of its way to specifically say this is a G.I. Joe Vietnam footlocker. Not just a footlocker, but a Vietnam footlocker, which is an interesting detail, is it not? And then I think you take that and you combine it with the way we characterize Renshaw early in the story. I love this moment right here where he gets home before he's even opened the footlocker yet. He gets home and he walks out onto his balcony and surveys the city. And it says, he pushed open the sliding glass door and stepped out. It was cold and the wind knifed through his thin topcoat. Yet he paused a moment, looking over the city the way a general might survey a captured country. So those two things combined make me think that this whole thing is just a Vietnam metaphor, right? You have the big literal giant American versus the little guys. He probably should win. He's the big one. He's the quote unquote more powerful one. They're just foot high little soldiers, right? They're just the little guy. And yet he gets his ass royally kicked.
Yeah. It's also, I mean, so I didn't even really think about this until you pointed this out, but you know, this story came out in 72. Vietnam War didn't even end until 75.
Yeah.
So the idea that this is going to escalate to the point of nuclear war was not. It was something that was possible, right? It was something that the people at the time were worried about. So the idea of the literal, you know, Vietnam, identified soldiers escalating things to nuking him, very much more pointed when you see it that way, I think.
Yeah. I feel like that's intentional. Again, with the idea that like we take special time to point out that these are Vietnam soldiers, and I know my metaphor doesn't work perfectly because the toy soldiers are like textually American toy soldiers. I get it. It doesn't work perfectly, but it just feels right to me.
Yeah, it's definitely somewhere in that space.
I also really like this part. So of course the thing that happens is he chucks his Molotov at the toy soldiers and sprints towards the door, and then they detonate a nuclear weapon, and he's dead. And presumably the entire top floor of the apartment building is gone with him. And as the pieces and of poor Renshaw rain down on the people below, we have two people that see this, and here's what they say to each other. "I don't like it," she said nervously. "Call a cab, huh, Ralph? We'll have to talk to cops if something happens up there. I ain't supposed to be out with you." And I pointed this out because I just love that detail, right? Like, well, what does it matter? We don't know who these people are. They're not characters in the story. They're just the things that we're using to end everything. And yet we take time to build this thing around, I'm doing something bad with you.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It's just this. It's really again, I'm really just fascinated by the choices that he's making here.
Yeah,
and that is just a little snippet of some greater story going on as well.
totally. Yeah, it's this evocative little piece of microfiction where you're like, wait, what? And then it's over. Yeah, there's you can kind of say he does that a lot in this story, where there's like little threads to other things, like how it begins referring to some assassination he just carried out, where you're like, what?
Yeah.
What? And then it was like, no, we're not talking about that anymore. That was just introducing the character. So yeah, it's and then you also, I think, it's easy to forget this kind of thing, because at a certain point you just kind of accept the story at face value. But I think the first time through, I was like, where did the toy soldiers come from? Like, are these is this magic? Is this is it like, is there some wizard that made this, or are they from another dimension of small people, of Lilliputian soldiers? Like, and the book offers 0.0% in the way of explaining anything related to that. No interest in that at all, which I like, because it just lets you imagine and wonder. But that element in and of itself is like a little thread that goes off into the darkness, where you're like, what is this?
Yeah, I mean, all we know is that the man he just assassinated's mother is the one that sent this package to the man he just assassinated. How it got here, we don't know. And yeah, there's some implication that she has she's very creative and is the key to their success. But the fact that we have no detail on how any of that works is wonderful, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a theme through basically every single story we're talking about tonight, right? With the exception of maybe Strawberry Spring, because it's the least supernatural of the five of them. But in those previous four, like, what is the stuff in the beer can? I don't know. I don't fucking know. What is going on with these toy soldiers? No idea. Why did the trucks suddenly become sentient? No idea. How are these ghosts like back to haunt this guy? I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's not important to the story. The story doesn't focus on the whys of any of this stuff, just that it's there. And it just moves on with it.
Yeah, you're right. That's fantastic. And I didn't quite realize how pervasive that was, but yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of which, Matt, let's move on to trucks.
Yay. The best story ever.
The story was originally published in the June 1973 issue of Cavalier magazine, and I love the story, Matt. I love it so much. It's not like, I don't think I would ever list this as like one of my favorite Stephen King short stories, but it is just absolutely delightful to read. What did you think about Trucks?
I mean, I might list it as one of my favorite Stephen King short stories, because it's like it's everything he does well, and just like the most Stephen King premise ever. As we've pointed out many times, like, he's fond of the premise, which is just, what if blank was evil? What if ironing machine was evil? And this is just, what if all the trucks became evil? And it's just the perfect implementation of that idea. It's so good, and it's and it like pulls you along, and like there's even though it's really short, there's like twists and turns to it, and you're invested in the characters. And I'm just like, yeah, if I was like, seriously, if I was going to introduce somebody to Stephen King short fiction, I might start here.
That's great. I love the story, but I never would have thought of it that way. And so your reaction to this is just absolutely delightful to me.
Good.
As was your reaction when you finished reading it, which was, I hope they made an adaptation of this one.
If they hadn't, I wanted to make an adaptation of this one. Except I want to use like self-driving trucks, and then it's like a AI apocalypse angle,
Oh, I get it. Well, don't you worry, Matt, because not only did they make an adaptation of this one, but we will be watching on other levels of the tower next month.
Perfect. Can't wait.
So I love the story, but one of the things I like most about it actually is the opening, because King kind of drops us completely in media res here, right? To the point where we don't actually know what's going on at all. Like, suddenly we're in the story and there are all these people in a truck stop. One of them is about to go crazy, and we learn that there's like a bunch of 18-wheelers like just idling outside the truck stop. The text describes them as roaring. We see that there's some crashed, overturned cars and some dead people out there, and we're like, what? And then suddenly the one guy like goes sprinting outside the building, and he's immediately run down by one of the trucks. And then and only then at that point is when the text finally lets us know what is actually happening here, which is that the big kind of show-stopping quote of there was no one in the trucks. Because even before that point, like, you could just say that the text is describing the trucks and not describing the people in them, but we make the assumption that there are people driving these vehicles. And then it's like, oh, no, wait, no. And then this is where the story finally gets to open up.
I mean, honestly, I think there's enough kind of hints, and also the title of the story itself, where, and also the fact that it's Stephen King and he likes to write about evil thing. I was like, oh my God, it's going to be the trucks. The trucks are evil. And even before the reveal, I was just like smiling at this idea, because I was like, this is a good idea. This is like, you can already tell this is going to be fun because this is just a good idea.
Yeah. And like I said, one of my favorite things about it is that there's no explanation. Like, some of the characters are like musing at what could possibly have caused this, and they're any idea is as plausible as any other one, and they just kind of move on. But I love this quote from the teenage girl that's stuck here as well. She says, "We made them," the girl cried out with sudden wretchedness. "They can't." And I think that's kind of one of the pieces of unlocking maybe the story underneath the story, actually. And I love it so much.
Yeah, sure. Definitely some kind of metaphor about our, I don't know if metaphor is quite the right word here, but gesturing at our feeling of mastery over the world, which is actually just an illusion, and how we actually frequently make technology that destroys us. Which is a big theme of his overall.
Yeah, I mean, it ends up kind of being an environmentalist message at the back half of this one, which is just, again, not where I would expect a story about sentient trucks to go. But so that's kind of where we go from here, is that eventually the trucks cut the power. And then I've written in here an Aliens quote because I couldn't help myself.
What do you mean the trucks cut the power? They're animals.
And so that kind of changes the calculus, and there's all these things characters have to do. I think we see our narrator character has to rush to the bathroom to get some water out of the toilet, because he knows that with the power cut, eventually they're not going to be able to get water. And so it's all fun, like, survivalist stuff going on here. But I guess I wanted to talk to you about the characters a little bit here, because I think that the interesting thing about the characterization here is that we have all these characters stuck in the truck stop. We have a young boy, his girlfriend, a trucker, the counterman, the narrator. I find it interesting that it's not that they're not characterized, but because they are, but the ways in which King actually doesn't bother to let us get to know them at all. Like, I don't think we learn much of their names at all. Like, I think the text usually refers to them as the girl, the boy, the trucker, the counterman, it's just really interesting. And again, it's not as if they're not characterized, because I think we get to know them pretty well as like characters, but just we don't have the kind of Stephen King diversions that I think you normally would see, where we like dive into an anecdote that tells you about X person's background, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I feel like it gives a more of a sense of urgency and bleakness to the story, where like things just happen so quickly, and like characters you might have become slightly attached to suddenly get pulverized by the trucks, like, without ceremony. And I think that's important to the evolution of the main character's sort of mentality, because he starts out being kind of a fighter, and then like toward the end you realize, like, okay, he's actually just going to try to survive. And so despite the fact that he was going to try to fight, now he's basically going to give up. And and it's actually kind of a depressing ending. Obviously it's a depressing ending, but it's especially depressing because you're riding along with this protagonist who, like, you thought he was going to be the hero, and stand up at the trucks and defeat them, and then it's like he just gives up, and that's like the roughest part of the story to me, is that is kind of the character's mentality shifting over the course of the story.
Sure. Yeah. The ways in which that defiance is crushed. And again, you're right, so quickly. Like the story moves very fast. And I think part of the feeling of it moving very fast is that, again, we start in the middle of it, right? There's already, when we join the story, there's already been attempts of people to escape from this truck stop that didn't go well. And that's why there are crashed cars and corpses laying in the parking lot and stuff like that. So that also helps us, where we're in the middle of the crisis, not at the beginning of it.
Yeah. And, the other thing is, despite the fact that this story is beginning in a diner, which is, or is this a diner, or is this just like a gas station convenience store?
I think it's like a truck. I think it's like a truck stop. So I think it's a convenience store / like diner. Like there's a countertop where people stop and eat and stuff like that.
I think you're right. But the point of bringing that up was to say, these people don't know each other, and that's part of why we can't go on to these digressions, because you can't be like, that was Billy Bob, who's Susie's kid, and he used to take my, he used to bring me my papers on. Like, no, these people are all like, they're just traveling across the country, and then everything goes to shit suddenly, and they take shelter at this location, and they don't know each other. Like that's actually important to like the feel of the story.
Sure. Isn't it also fun that it's just trucks? It's like, it's not like I guess I don't know how this thing that's happening just says, oh, I'm sorry, that's a sedan. No, you don't get to come alive. It's just trucks.
Yeah, sedans,
trucks of all sizes and shapes, but still just trucks.
Yeah, and anything that a 3-year-old would identify as a truck, including buses.
And airplanes, apparently. There's a hint at the very end.
Oh, yeah.
Possibly airplanes.
Yeah, that's true.
But not like a car. Nope, those aren't special.
No, not big enough.
So eventually, Matt, one of the trucks dies from lack of gas, and they realize that they've got these machines beat. They might be horrible monster trucks, but they can't pump their own gas, which is when the trucks start to communicate with them in Morse code, demanding that somebody pumps the gas for them, that if that person does that, they will be spared. And to prove their point and to prove the power they have, they start to threaten to tear down their little truck stop. And this is where the story gets delightful to me, because like this is the Stephen King part of it, right? I think the idea centrally of, oh, what if trucks came alive and wanted to kill people, is fun. But the place the idea goes, which is this place of, okay, actually, they're just going to like hold us hostage and demand that humans become their slaves to pump gas into them for eternity. It is such a delightful turn of the story, like we're the end of the story has just human beings sitting in a truck stop going, should we be slaves to the trucks forever?
Yeah.
Or should we try to resist?
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, what's great about it is how you're sort of overwhelmed by the cold, inescapable logic of it. Like you're with the characters, where like at first you're like, okay, good, they're going to run out of gas, and the nightmare will be over. This will have just been like a one-off thing. And then there's the gradual realization of like, well, no, because some number of people are going to help refuel the trucks out of fear. And then some number of people are going to like keep the supply chains running, and then you realize like, oh my God, the trucks are going to win. The trucks are going to win. They're bigger than us, and we depend on them for our infrastructure anyway. So we can't just we can't properly fight them, because they are our means of coordinating ourselves. It's very like surprisingly smart, thoughtful resolution, right, for such a silly premise.
Yeah. Well, and this is the part I really like, where the narrator is kind of weighing his options and says, "So much of the world is paved now. Even the playgrounds are paved. And for the fields and marshes and deep woods, there are tanks, half tracks, flatbeds equipped with lasers, masers, heat-seeking radar, and little by little, they can make it into the world they want. I can see great convoys of trucks filling the Okefenokee swamp with sand, the bulldozers ripping through the national parks and wildlands, grading the earth flat, stamping it into one great flat plain, and then the hot tub trucks arriving." And yeah, it's like this wonderful realization of, oh no, they can do anything. And I like the part where he's like, I'm imagining the assembly lines creating new trucks.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and the people working on this and just dropping dead and being replaced, which reminds you of the way we treat our machines.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do think there is like we said, there's the environmental message here of like, this is kind of what we've been doing anyway, right? It's like the paving over of the natural world has kind of just been, we've been on this perpetual path towards this for a long time, and this is just taking that to the nth degree here.
Yeah.
With the technology itself. So, I mean, it is in essence an AI story in a lot of ways, just framed differently.
Yeah, right. That's the thing, is it would work seamlessly if you just said, okay, it's set in 2028, where all of the trucks are now self-driving electric trucks, and 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 then you can even explain it. You can be like, well, the AIs realized that this was a perfect place to attack us, where we wouldn't really be able to fight back effectively, because how would you? Of course, I kind of like that this isn't explained, but it does just work so perfectly with that idea that I couldn't resist it.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, is like, I get that, and I think that would function perfectly if they were to remake trucks now. But it would also be like, I've told you before about the Child's Play movies, where in the original, Chucky was just a serial killer that performed a magical voodoo spell and got trapped in the body of a doll. And then the reboot of Chucky, they just made it a AI gone rogue story. And there was something just reducing about that I just didn't love, actually. And I feel like one of the things I like most about the story is the fact that there's really no explanation, and it's just some weird magic random thing that happened that people have to deal with.
And you don't really know what the trucks want, but presumably they want to be trucks, so they want to pay everything.
Yeah, they just want to live.
Yeah, it's great.
I mean, like, this is kind of like a prisoner dilemma thing, right? Where like, really, if every human just said no, we're not going to pump any gas into you.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't going to say it because I feel like I call too many things prisoner's dilemmas, but yes, it is a prisoner's dilemma, because yes, if the problem is that's why I was disappointed in this character, is he's the classic defector in the prisoner's dilemma, where he's like, we can't give in, and then he gives in, and he becomes one of the defectors, which if people like him were willing to, that's the thing, is he'd have to be willing to basically sacrifice his life and let the trucks kill him, because they were going to just run down the whole gas station. And presumably a lot of people around the world are in similar positions, so it's how many people are actually willing to sacrifice their life for something, especially if they strongly suspect other people are going to defect anyway.
Yeah. I mean, you got to give it up to our guy. He tried. He did successfully firebomb that dump truck.
It's true.
And then they just brought in a new truck. And he's like, "Oh wait, we lose."
Yeah.
There's a lot of trucks out there.
Yeah.
I do also really like the idea that we're stuck in our character's point of view to the point where we don't get to see where all this is happening, and what the state of humanity is at this point, right? I mean, the one thing we do know, and the kind of beautiful image that this beautifully haunting image that this story ends on, is like, there's just this impossibly long line of trucks waiting to get gassed up at this one truck stop. And that just like the three remaining people alive at the end of the story are just like taking like 6-hour shifts, like perpetually just nonstop filling up trucks with gas. This horrifying image. So like, I don't know. Like, it seems like it's one of the few places in the area that's doing this. Is That's why all the trucks are gathering there, but we don't really know.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's one of those. It causes you to then step away from the story and think like, well, I wonder what's going on in like the cities,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
in other in far away places where there maybe aren't as many trucks, or you know, it's the kind of premise, it's the kind of short story where part of the reason you keep thinking about it is you're like, well, what about this aspect of the thing that wasn't really mentioned in the story, but it's just the thing the premise demands that you ask that question and then mull it over. That's
yeah, yeah.
that's the genius of a good short story, is it forces you to think about it later for all kinds of reasons.
Totally, totally. All right. So that's Trucks, Matt. We will have to wait a little bit to hear your reaction to the adaptation titled Maximum Overdrive. In some ways, it's similar to this story, Matt, and in other ways, it's very, very, very different. So,
Okay. Well, I can't wait one way or the other.
yeah, we will see. It's been a long time since I've watched it too, so I'm looking forward to it.
All right.
All right, let's move on to the fourth story of the week. This is also our longest story. I think it's the longest story in the book so far, actually. It's titled Sometimes They Come Back, and was also a Cavalier magazine story originally published in the March 1974 issue. And this is, like we said at the beginning, this is one of those ones that were, it's weird. It's weird to emotionally and mentally shift from trucks to this story. This story that is haunting and terrifying, and this horrifying little explanation of how one traumatic event can ripple through a person's entire life and kind of destroy it. It's Man, I like the story a whole lot, but it is such a different vibe from the ones that came before it.
Yeah, it really it's kind of hard. It's really heavy. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
exceptionally heavy even for Stephen King, where you're just like, oh shit. Like I found it upsetting. It's a very I'll probably say this more than once as we go through this, but like I found it to be almost a mean story in terms of like the places where it goes and how unflinching and like unmerciful it is, in the just the whole idea of it, the premise of it, the things that happen in the
Mm-hmm.
story. I'm just like, oh my god, fuck.
Yeah.
Like I'm sad, you know.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. It's rough. Oh, so let's get into it. Our story begins with our protagonist, Jim Norman, who has just completed an interview for a teacher's position at a new school. We learn very quickly that Jim has had a pretty traumatic life, that he had a breakdown in a previous job, and has had recurring nightmares for most of his life, mostly related to the death of his brother. I think one interesting thing about Jim, and the thing that I think separates him from so many of the other protagonists in this collection specifically, is that he seems like just a good dude, really. Like,
Yeah.
he's smart, he wants to help out kids. Like, the reason he became a teacher, we learn, is because like that's what his brother wanted to do, and his mom kind of says, he kind of decides to do this, and his mom encouraged, like on her deathbed, like encourages him towards this. Like, he we see he signs up for the tough schools, the inner city schools, I guess you could call them, and he wants to challenge himself. He wants to do good where good is needed, and that is such a stark comparison to so many of the other protagonists we've had in these short stories. And then this story is like monstrously cruel to this guy, actually.
Yeah. I agree. This is one of the stories where like the horror of it is not, a gray goo blob or a bunch of rats or whatever. It's just like a horrible, horrible thing that happened to a guy, where
Yeah.
a guy's brother
Hmm.
was murdered when they were kids, and it's horribly traumatizing and it's upsetting to think about. Nothing supernatural about it. And I think that just highlights the tragedy of it, and because it's
Hmm.
so realistic, it makes it land harder for me, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. Um, so our character gets the job that he was hoping for, and but along with this job and this new opportunity, his old nightmares start to immediately return. I also like this depiction of the school, Matt, which is this, it's actually this pretty well off school. I think we learned that they have like a $1.5 million science wing or something. But we get this too. But after the kids were gone, something old and brooding seemed to settle over the halls and whisper in the empty rooms. Some black, noxious beast, never quite in view. Sometimes, as he walked down the Wing 4 corridor toward the parking lot with his new briefcase in one hand, Jim Norman thought he could almost hear it breathing. And this, of course, I think will be the demon that he ends up summoning later in the story. But
Yeah.
I love the tonal feeling of like he's got this new opportunity in this new school, things are going okay, and yet there's this pall that kind of just hovers over everything.
Yeah, I actually forgot about the reference to the possibility of the school building being haunted, because things go a different direction pretty shortly.
Yeah. But overall, Jim's work is going well, right? He's enjoying the work. He's only got one problem class. He's got this damn living with literature class that is the 7th period, the last period of the day. It's a class with kids who don't really care about school or books and just need this as an easy elective. The troublemakers, you could say. And he's got one particular troublemaker in specifically that's making his life hard. I do. So there is a thing that the story does, and on reread, it really kind of exposed itself. Was this? There's little drops and dribbles of information related to the root cause of everything that's happening with Jim, because we don't actually get to see the dream he had and how his brother's murder actually played out for a while. But like the first thing we learn about him is he had this breakdown at this previous school when he was student teaching. And the breakdown was related to the fact that he saw 2 kids bullying another kid and he stepped in to help and he himself got assaulted. And it's like, yeah, I get how you could have a negative reaction to that, but like it like he has like, it's trauma motivated, right? Where he can't even get close to the school without completely hyperventilating and freaking out. And then here at this school, like when the particular troublemaker pushes back against him, he's like immediately like, whoa, like freaking out a little bit and you don't really understand it all quite yet, but the story is kind of setting you up for the reveal, I guess, of where all this comes from.
Yeah, I wish I copied down the language, but there's this beautiful sentence somewhere in there that's like, nobody trusted you after you had a breakdown because it was like when you broke a vase, even if you glued it back together, you could never trust that it would hold water. It's like this beautiful metaphor for the idea of like once a person breaks in that way, you can never quite trust them again, or they can, or he's never going to trust himself again, perhaps.
Yeah, I think both for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sorry, go ahead.
No, just that's kind of what you were getting at there is like he's so fragile basically at this point in his life. Yeah.
And it just seems like everything that's happening to him is pushing him back into this bad place. We finally get to see, what is in this dream, which we learn is just kind of a reenactment of the murder of his brother. And so we kind of get to see that play out in real time. And the writing here, I think, is just wonderfully effective. Like the atmosphere, the thrumming of the train going overhead, the dialogue is all italicized in the dream, from the bullies and how they're reacting, and the character's powerlessness in it. It just really works to really get you, and you suddenly understand this guy and why this thing has ruled his life for all these years.
Yeah, it's true. And because the fact that this was held from us, like we didn't really know what his deal was. So maybe we were partly like, oh, come on, like what is going on? And then when you learn this story, I was immediately just like, oh, I just feel really bad for this guy now. Like,
yeah.
This is just awful. I didn't really know where the story was going yet. It's interesting how just in stark contrast to the other stories in this week's reading, like we really are not given a clue about where we're going with this for quite a while.
Yeah, I don't think you really know where the story's going, literally until the story goes there.
Yeah.
And that to me is one of the most interesting things about that. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's at this point of the story that, Jim goes off on winter break and kind of resettles himself, and everything's going well again. He returns to school, and he's got a new student. A student has died over the winter break, and there's a new one to take his place. And this kid looks exactly like the kid with the strawberry birthmark that killed his brother. And this is the part of the story where I have this very distinct memory of reading this story the first time, because I read this part and I was like, I know where this is going now. I know where this is going. This is a guy who is on the verge of breakdown, has this traumatic event that has defined his life, and he still has not gotten over it. He has not processed it at all. And suddenly he's seeing kids in his class that remind him, or to him, are exactly like these kids that killed his brother. And I thought the story was going to end on a twist. I thought the story was going to be about this guy who has a breakdown and ends up murdering a bunch of children who he has decided are definitely ghosts or reincarnation or whatever of the three kids responsible for his brother's death. And I thought that's where the story was going to go. And obviously that is not where the story goes at all. But I found it, like, it just seemed to me like that's where we were going with it. And it's not that I dislike this story, but there's always part of me that, like, when we get to the eventual reveal of where the story is going, I just always kind of go, huh, okay.
Oh, really? Yeah.
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 And so I don't even know if that's a good or a bad thing that it chooses not to go in this particular route. It would be a much, much darker story, and it's already a dark story, and it would be like 10 times darker if it went the route that I thought it was going to go. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, for the record, I 100% thought the same thing as you. That we were watching a guy who was losing his mind. We already have established that he has these nervous breakdowns, that he is traumatized by this event. Totally plausible that he could be hallucinating, and that maybe these, you already see it writing itself, right? Like, he murders these kids, and then as soon as they're dead, he looks at their faces and realizes that they don't look like the kids who he thought they were at all. And, the Twilight Zone zoom out shot at the end. But no, we got something much more literal and magical, and like a very straight, like he's being haunted by the trauma of it. Literally, they literally return to haunt him. It's that the sometimes they come back is specific to the actual specific kids who murdered his brother are now back, and he needs to deal with them.
And I like that. I like how that functions as a metaphor. Yeah, like the idea that we're literalizing the idea that you carry your trauma with you wherever you go, and it will always come back is perfect. I like it a whole lot. But yeah, it's just very, very different from where I thought we were going.
Yeah, me too. I agree.
And even so, like with lines like this, like he's writing on the board, and one of the kids, I think the new kid, throws a grapefruit at the board, and his reaction is, someone ought to have this jammed down his goddamn throat. And he's having that kind of reaction in the middle of class. And that you read a line like that and you're like, oh yeah, this guy's going to go nuts and he's going to murder some kids. And you're just kind of primed for that. And that, yeah, again, that's just not where it goes at all.
Yeah. I know this is probably unfair and wrong, but part of me imagines that King was going to write that and was then I don't know, as a teacher or ex-teacher, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't write that.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know.
Maybe.
I don't know.
No, I like that. So twice more kids in his class are murdered or have accidents, and twice more 2 new kids appear. And it's, of course, the other 2 that killed Jim's brother, Wayne. And so it very, very quickly becomes very apparent what's actually going on here.
Yeah, definitely. And then it starts to get really mean.
Yeah, it gets really mean from here. I really do love this moment, though, when the old bully, like his old problem kid, is a bully named Chip Osway, who was just an ass to him and cheated on tests and just like the worst kid he had at class. But that guy comes to him absolutely terrified by the new guys. He's been hanging out with two of the three of the new guys, and he's absolutely terrified of them. Like the joking around that he was doing, the complaining about teachers that he was doing, they are taking to a new level, and he's scared of them. And it's this perfect way of showing that things have escalated, right? You have this premier troublemaker from before can't hold a candle to the trouble that these guys represent.
Yeah.
Love it.
They're just monsters.
Yeah. And it ends up being him that is the third murder victim that is replaced with what's his name? Vinny, the leader of the ghost gang.
Right. I mean, just in case I'm not being clear about it, like this is part of what's mean is that they're just like, I don't know, for some reason the idea of them just like murdering these other high school students casually just so that they can fuck with this guy, it strikes me as so horrible and cruel. And like, because the text takes the time to go into like the next victim was, some girl who liked to feed the pigeons on top of her apartment building or whatever, and you're like, oh, I don't want her to be dead, even though I just found out about her existence.
Yeah, she was the girl who like answered the question in class correctly. And it's like all the people that he actually really likes are being replaced by these literal ghost monsters.
Yeah, that's not and murdering the students isn't even the meanest thing that we do.
No, yeah. One thing I wanted to talk to you about though is, as Jim realizes that the high school that these three said they came from is actually just a graveyard, and they've been dead the whole time. That begs the question: who filed this paperwork? So there's a whole bunch of paperwork for each one of these three students that shows, the high school they went to, and that they've been, it's got their rap sheet on there too, the trouble they've been in before, and it's obviously complete enough to where the school looks at it and approves it and enrolls them, literally enrolls these ghost kids in school. How does that work?
It's some flunky of the Crimson King is filling out the paperwork.
Just really good. Yeah, it's the Sombra Corporation. Just really good at making fake paperwork.
Now I want a short story about like the guy who's responsible for all of these like little niggling details that we just overlook in these stories where it's like, how much work it is to get 3 boys enrolled in a high school when those boys are dead. You got to forge so many different distinct things. And not only that, but I had to have their file photo be them mean mugging the camera and do that in a way where it didn't raise any alarms.
You ever tried to get a ghost to sit still for a photo shoot? It ain't easy. I love this.
Yes, this is fun. This is great.
This is another thing I just wanted to point out as we move our way through the story. So at this point, Jim has like called the old detective that worked on the police force at the place where he grew up back when he was a kid, and he has very fond memories of this old man who used to always buy him pie a la mode every time he saw him at the local diner. And he calls him, and the guy says, "Do you still like a good piece of pie a la mode, Jimmy?" And he says, "Sure." It was a lie. He hated pie a la mode.
Yeah.
I don't know why I love that so much, but I just do. This idea that like this thing, I think it goes back to be serious for a sec. It goes back to the memories of the past and how those memories define us. And to this guy, this defining moment of this kid was, he fed him pie with some ice cream on it, and the kid really loved it. And to Jimmy, this has been part of his past that is just, he hates, and it haunts him, and he's tried to escape from his entire life.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think that's basically what it is. Because nobody hates pie a la mode, right?
No, it's fucking pie with ice cream. Yeah. How could you hate that?
Right. The only reason you would say that is if it were associated with something really horrible.
Yeah. So at this point in the story, Matt, Vinny, the leader of the ghost gang, just decides to abandon all the pretense and just come out and say exactly what's going on here, that we're ghosts and we're going to kill you. Which is a really interesting choice, right?
Yeah, no, it's like this huge, like, it's like you take the story and you just turn it at a right angle, because
Hmm.
I really did think it was all going to be a hallucination right up till that point. I was like, right up until that point, I was like,
Hmm.
okay, and then at any minute now, we're going to reveal that these kids are actually just totally different kids and it's all a coincidence. And no, King is like, nope, it's actually them. And I think it's, in a sense, it's good that we're just totally cutting off that alternate line of thinking right here, and cutting it off very sharply and intentionally, because otherwise
Yeah.
you might get confused about what you're supposed to be feeling. So I think he fairly aggressively kind of corrects us on course, and then things play out differently from here.
Yeah, I think you're right. I wonder if like he wrote the original draft of the story and then looked back on it and was like, no, I need this moment to kind of definitively declare that this is actually, yes, what's happening and this is where the story is going to go. Because I mean, from here the story like takes off in some wild directions. So he needs that centering moment almost, and that's what the conversation between the two of them does.
Yeah, yeah.
So okay, here's another part. I don't know. I could be reading into this. I could be going insane. But Jim is sitting at home. His wife is about to die, but we don't know that yet. He's reading a book. The book is titled Raising Demons, and her reaction to it is, ew. And it doesn't say anything about the book in this moment. It just says he's sitting on the couch reading a book called Raising Demons. And I'm like 90% sure that King is doing some jokey bullshit here, Matt, because Raising Demons is the title of, I think, Shirley Jackson's second memoir. She wrote two memoirs. Raising Demons is the title of the second one. So I really do feel like if you know that and you know how much King likes Shirley Jackson, you read this part of the story. He's reading a book called Raising Demons, and you just maybe assume that that's what it is, and then it turns out that the book he's actually reading is just literally a book about how to summon demons. And I don't know. It just feels like the exact kind of nerdy Stephen King humor to me. I have no idea if I'm right here, but I find it hilarious.
No, that seems like exactly the kind of joke that he probably like occurred to him when he read the Shirley Jackson memoir, and then he's like, I have to work this into something somewhere somehow someday. And he did. No, I mean, that you're totally right. Like, I'm sure he's aware of the existence of it, and this is definitely a joke.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that I never heard of the Shirley Jackson memoir until you told me about it, I'm
Mm-hmm.
so confident that you're right about this.
Well, good. I'm glad, because I wrestled with this in my head for way too long. It's like, is this a thing? Is he doing this on I don't know.
It's so nerdy and literary. It's so good.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Matt, and then the trio kill Jim's wife. Um,
Uh huh.
it's really weird because like we already know that these three ghost demon children are murderers. Like that's the defining characteristic of them actually. But still, even in this moment, this feels like such a shocking escalation of things to me, to the point where like it kind of took my breath away when it happened. Actually, I don't know why. Do you have any hint towards why that would be? That just is like, oh, it feels like we've gone up a level.
I mean, we actually like and care about his wife somewhat, and we actually really like and care about him. So, taking his life, which already kind of sucks, and like the only thing he's got really going for him at this point is like, well, at least he's got a loving wife, and then just
Yeah,
brutally murdering her and like totally ruining his life is like,
sure.
I mean, basically my note that I've written in the script at this point is just in all caps, "fuck you" book. Because
Mm-hmm.
that was my I'm expressing my feelings. And this is maybe a pet peeve with me, but like there is a certain level of like meanness of a story where it actually pushes me away from the story, and I kind of check out because I'm like, okay, if you're just gonna kick me in the nuts, then I don't really need to like let you keep doing that. There's almost like a psychological protective mechanism that kicks in where I'm like, okay, all right, we're gonna kill the wife now. All right, whatever, fine. And then I kind of care less, actually, despite the fact that obviously it's the kind of choice you make to
Yeah.
escalate the tension. It's like, well, for me, it's kind of too far. Um, and I don't know. Again, maybe I'm just a weirdo here, but uh, Yeah, I think that's what I mean when I say this is a mean story. Is it just
Yeah.
keeps hitting you with these things where you're like, oh Jesus, all right,
I think for me, part of it was perhaps that I didn't think the story was actually going to do that. I think the story
uh,
introduces the idea that they're threatening his wife. Like they're saying, we're gonna kill your wife. Like I think Vinny comes right out and says it. And at that moment, I'm just like, no, he's gonna stop him first, or something's gonna happen. This is gonna come to a head before that moment actually happens.
yeah,
And then it does. It happens exactly the way Vinny said it was going to. And you're just like, what?
yeah.
Huh? That can't happen.
I think I share the sentiment you just expressed, which is actually more like confusion, where you're like, well, why did he let that happen? Like, why didn't
Yeah.
he act before that point? Is the idea that he was like scared of them, was too scared to act? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know if I saw him as traumatized, but I don't know if I saw him as so fearful that he would just kind of go Tharn and let them do these things.
Yeah, but to be fair, I mean, I don't know. Like, what do you do short of summon a demon to eat them? Like, I don't know. Like, I think in my mind, if the story wanted to show us perhaps that like the issue here, see, to me, the metaphor here is that this is what trauma does: is it destroys not only you but everyone around you.
Yeah.
This is the horrible power of it. But so to me, if the story wanted to be like, this is a consequence of your inaction, it could have drawn that more directly, and it didn't seem to do that.
I mean, I think despite the fact that I guess I just kind of criticized the way the story landed for me, I think you're totally right about that being the intended metaphor. And, the final image of this story is this man who's lost everything, including having maimed himself, as we're about to see.
Mm-hmm.
And, uh, and that's where he's left. That's what his trauma has left him with. Is it's taken it. He seemed to be able to go on with his life, but it came back. It wasn't actually gone. It came back, and it robbed everything else that he had except his life.
Yeah.
And maybe it's even going to take that too. We're kind of left with the question of maybe he doesn't even really survive.
Yeah, yeah. Because
And
he's not. I mean, to really embrace the metaphor for a bit, he's not actually dealing with the trauma. He's mostly just running away from it.
yeah,
Or putting different things in its path.
yeah, he's
And
just
so
being
the
tortured. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I like this a lot.
Yeah, right. And so in that case, in that sense, it makes sense to kill his wife for the simple reason that we want, I guess we being, the writer here, which is a weird way of saying that, but the the writer wants you to get the understanding that he has had everything taken from him by his
Yes.
trauma. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. I think that's right. All right. So, God, we've talked about this, how sad this whole death scene is. I think the writing here is really, really good, actually. The writing around the funeral. I just want to read this passage real quick. Funeral, like a dance in 3 acts. The house, the funeral parlor, the graveyard. Faces coming out of nowhere, whirling close, whirling off into the darkness again. Sally's mother, her eyes streaming tears behind a black veil. Her father looking shocked and old. Simmons. Others. They introduced themselves and shook his hand. He nodded, not remembering their names. Some of the women brought food, and one lady brought an apple pie, and someone ate a piece. And when he went out into the kitchen, he saw it sitting on the counter, cut wide open and drooling juice into the pie plate like amber blood. I don't know, man. That's just like the way I think that the short, one word sentences really capture this. Like he's not fully there. He's zoned out. Like he's not thinking completely. It just I thought that was just great writing.
Yeah, no, great depiction of this shell shocked state that he's in. And really, for the whole book, the whole story rather, is about reactions to traumatic events, and so makes sense that he would want to focus on that kind of writing for this.
Yeah. So Jim decides he has to act now, Matt, and he heads back to the school and summons a demon to take care of the ghost children. The cost of this summoning is his 2 index fingers, as you hinted towards. But it's cool. You don't need those. They're not important ones.
No, I think I could manage without old righty and lefty.
What do you think is the significance of index finger itself? Like, why is that? Is there any like metaphorical significance here?
Couldn't think of anything really other than that it's like probably the most useful finger if you don't count the thumb as a finger.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
sometimes I ask questions because I don't know the answer, and this was one of those instances.
I mean, just to kind of pick at it though, like the demon also is like really pleased to get like a headband with sweat on it or something.
Yeah, sweat is powerful. Yeah.
Like that. Yeah, sweat is powerful, man. That seemed to be the thing that the demon was almost like most excited about, which is its own interesting thing. Where you're like, what are we saying with that? Is that tied into the theme? Is the idea that the demon likes certain kinds of sacrifice and maybe it's not even what you would think it would be. That the value of like what is sweat? Sweat is hard work. Sweat is effort and toil and suffering. And it really likes that. Like it seemed to really enjoy the sweat. I thought that was
maybe
interesting.
So the trio comes, and what I find so interesting about this ritual and how it actually plays out, Matt, is that Jim kind of intentionally recreates the scenario in which the murders happened. And we see that the ghosts are kind of like forced into it, in the history kind of starts to repeat itself, and everyone just starts, like, even though they clearly don't want to, like, assumes their required role. Like even at the end when they kind of realize what's going on, they kind of can't help themselves but walk up to the Ralph image in the scenario, which we know is the demon, and stab it, which is what kind of completes their doom. It's this really interesting depiction of this. And I wonder if it's saying something specifically about the cyclical nature of trauma, and like that this thing rules over everything so much that when we re-engage with it, we just fall into our pre-scripted roles. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I totally agree with that. Like the idea of trauma and our reaction to trauma being something that kind of builds an automatic pattern into our behavior. Is, that's just a huge piece of what trauma is, and what our, trauma isn't just the event, it's the manifestation in the person. So I think you're and you right on. Yeah.
I mean, and it's interesting to kind of think about the 3 boys in that lens too. Not that I'm about to say like, oh, they were traumatized by the murder they did, but like, we have these 3 kids, and they did commit this murder, and then we know that a few weeks later they crashed their car and they all died, and yet they, for some reason, years and years and years later, are still obsessed with this event as well, right? Even in their ghost form. King doesn't show us why they're here or how they're here or any of this stuff, but they're still as obsessed and attached to this one event as Jim is. And I don't know, that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like them wanting to come after him specifically, it's a vindictiveness that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Like, why? Like,
he
what
didn't do
care?
anything to them.
Like they
fucked up his life, and then they went off and died on their own.
Yeah, and now they're back. Like, go enjoy being a ghost, man. Go enjoy being a high school student that's immortal or whatever. But it's not even a consideration. They're just bent on. It's not even revenge because he didn't do anything to them. It's they're bent on just like reenacting, I guess, like you just said, kind of reenacting their own trauma. They're chased by their trauma just as much as he is, you could say. I mean, I get what you say, where there's a reluctance to call that trauma, but it's like, it's just it's all they have now, I guess. Interesting.
They're completely beholden to it, just like Jim is. Yeah. Really, really interesting stuff. And it's all kind of subtextual to me. Like, it's not right there. It's not the main focus of the thing, but it's certainly there.
Yeah, I agree. I love it.
All right. So the story ends with Jim sending the demon in the form of Wayne off again. but he promises to return, and that's where the story ends. He says, you could perhaps summon them, perhaps cause them to do your work. You could even get rid of them, but sometimes they come back. And that's that's how our story ends, with nothing accomplished, really.
I love the writing at near to the end, where it's like he feels something behind him and he turns, and it's like he has the sense that something has just crouched back into the darkness, which I don't know. I just love that image, that feeling they left me with.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking to our metaphor, it shows that like you can't bargain your way out of the shitty stuff that's happened to you, right? Like there's no, even if you cut a deal to get out of that thing, you're only prolonging or delaying the effect it's going to have on you.
Yeah, I agree.
That he hasn't actually, by literally defeating the children responsible for his brother's death, he hasn't actually processed and allowed himself to get over the horrible thing that happened.
Yeah.
And so maybe it is very specific and poignant that the thing that's left over from all this, the part that remains, is Wayne. And because the demon has at the moment where he makes these threats to him, taken the form of Wayne. Mm-hmm. And so like this is actually the core of it all. It's not these three idiot kids who did something horrible. It's his brother's death and what his brother's death means.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing that's subtextual is that he clearly has a huge amount of guilt about his brother's death. It's a kind of survivor's guilt. And that's something where I don't think he ever really grapples with that consciously, but that's clearly, I don't want to say clearly, because it's like not clear actually, but it's there, right? I'm pretty sure that we're meant to understand that, like, that's a big piece of why this keeps, why he keeps having nightmares about it, is he feels guilty, he feels responsible, he feels like he could have done something different.
Yeah, because he took off, right? His brother told him to run, and he ran, and he left him. So, and there's definitely that survivor's guilt there for sure.
And you could say him, turning the tides and actually killing these kids could be viewed as like an attempt to do the right thing, but it's like, well, too little, too late. Actually, he put down these ghosts,
maybe in his mind, this is how you get over it, is by making up for the perceived failure, by defeating the children that did it. But yeah, that doesn't solve the actual problem. Like that's not the core of the actual trauma. That's just your misplaced guilt.
Yeah.
Because you were a kid. That's not your fault. Right. You didn't do anything wrong. Three idiots jumped you and your brother and they stabbed him to death. Yeah. There's nothing you could have done, that guilt is misplaced. It shouldn't be there. And just by merely getting rid of the people that caused the horrible tragedy doesn't mean you actually processed that whole thing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very awesomely fascinating that the way that the way he defeats them is actually that they literally stab Ralph again, right? I mean, it's not like he takes on the role of the one with the knife. It's like, no, they literally have to reenact the thing. Yeah, man, it's very rich, actually.
It is.
So I guess before we move on from it, we move on to the next story. Just like I was reflecting on how dark this story was and how it left me with this kind of sick feeling. And I was thinking, like, man, King like really is normally a softie. We've talked about this a lot. Normally, I guess he's more likely to leave you with a bummer ending in a short story. But I was just thinking about like how this might have played out if it were like a novel, and if it were following the more typical King structure. Then what you usually have happen is that the character and probably also their quartet, stand together, and they stand with the white against the evil, and possibly there's a heroic sacrifice, and we get to feel sad and poignant about that. But ultimately, they win by being the gunslingers and standing against the darkness with the white. And man, like, that is so far from this, because this character doesn't have a quartet. Everyone he loved is taken from him. And not only does he not stand with the white, he summons a demon. So it's just such a dark and dismal and sad and tragic turn especially if you view it as a statement about the nature of trauma. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I wonder, I we've talked about this king as a softie thing a whole lot, and I do think it's absolutely true. But I wonder how much of that is, time changing and reflecting on him. A lot of these stories we're reading right now are some of the earliest and first things he wrote, and wonder if like he was a little more hard and cruel early in his career. And I think our exploration into Richard Bachman is a perfect way to really explore that idea, which
yeah.
we will be doing after this book.
That's interesting. Yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah. All right, so that is Sometimes They Come Back. We move on to our final story of the week, which is Strawberry Spring. It's a really quick, short one. It's only 9 pages long. This one was originally published in the fall 1968 issue of Ubris magazine, which, as to remind you, that is the University of Maine literary journal. So he published this fall of his junior year in college. So he's still in school, very, very young Stephen King, probably maybe not even 21 yet. And he wrote and published this story. So which is fun because you think about this guy writing the story about this serial killer at campus.
Uh-huh.
And I wonder if anyone in his class is like
giving him the side eye for sure.
And he's like, "Oh, look, it's foggy outside. Do you want to go for a walk?"
Yeah, I'm sure
No.
he did shit like that. Totally sure.
What an interesting little 9-page story, Matt. We meet our narrator who is remembering a time 8 years prior to when the serial killer stalked around his university campus during a, quote, strawberry spring, which is described as a false bit of warm weather that makes you think that spring is here, but it's a lie. There's more cold coming after it. Fun fact, I don't think, and people, if anyone listening lives in Maine, maybe you can prove me wrong on this. I don't think the term strawberry spring is a real thing. I think King made it up. I'm pretty sure you would just call it a false spring. I think he just made up this term completely, which makes sense because I was trying to like pick at it and be like, why would you call this strawberry spring? What about this is strawberry? I don't know. Just a fun fact for you.
Okay. Yeah, I have no idea at all, but funny if true.
Yeah, I've heard the term false spring before, and of course this references Indian summer, which is a bout of a false bout of warm weather after an initial chill, that makes you think that summer's back, and no, it's not. It's a lie. But never heard of strawberry spring outside of the story.
Yeah, we didn't have any of that shit down in Texas.
No, that's certainly true. And the feel of it, like, is really, I think, when we get down to it, like the feel of it is what the story is kind of all about, right? And it reminds me of The Gunslinger a lot, not in content, but in how King writes it. This is a bit more musical of a story. It's a bit more poetic. It's written by a young man who maybe hasn't exactly found out what his voice is going to be yet, but is at least in this story trying for a very specific kind of thing. And I like it overall. It's I don't think I would ever list this one as one of my favorites, but I like it.
Yeah, I like it too. I agree with what you just said about it not sounding like King's voice. Like if you had shown this to me and asked me to guess who wrote it, I'm not super confident that I would have guessed King. It just doesn't sound like him. It's yeah, he's just much younger. I mean, man, it's if I think about my writing skill when I was a junior in college, it was not high, objectively, but yeah, I guess I'm just saying that it's understandable that he kind of changed a lot as an artist after this point.
Oh, certainly, and I do think like there's a lot of really good writing in this. Like this passage here. It says, "And when the night came, the fog came with it, moving silent and white along the narrow college avenues and thoroughfares. The pines on the mall poked through it like counting fingers, and it drifted, slow as cigarette smoke, under the little bridge down by the Civil War cannons. It made things seem out of joint, strange, magical. The unwary traveler would step out of the juke-thumping, brightly lit confusion of the grinder, expecting the hard, clear starriness of winter to clutch him. And instead, he would suddenly find himself in a silent, muffled world of white, drifting fog, the only sound his own footsteps and the soft drip of water from the ancient gutters. You half expected to see Gollum or Frodo or Sam hurrying past, or to turn and see that the grinder was gone, vanished, replaced by a foggy panorama of moors and yew trees, and perhaps a druid circle or a sparkling fairy ring. Like, there's something musical about that, right? And
Yeah.
the only hint that this is Stephen King is the Lord of the Rings reference.
Yes. Yeah, totally. The shameless Lord of the Rings reference is
Mm-hmm.
it's always the clearest indicator.
Yeah.
But no, I do love this. Like, it's very poetic and paints
Mm-hmm.
imagery. I mean, interestingly, I actually think King does a lot less descriptive writing typically. Like, it's not that he does none. It's just that it's not a tool that he usually leans on very hard. But here he's using a lot of descriptive writing. There's a lot of description of what the town is like, like physically and visually. That's something that he really does a lot of in this story.
Yeah, and it works. I think it works. It really does.
Yeah.
So, like, basically the story is kind of our narrator, lyrically recounting the murders of the women that happened at this time at the school, and one of the things the story spends a lot of time with, and one of the more interesting things about it to me, is kind of how these tragedies impact the people on campus. I love this part here where it says, the next day was overcast and sullen, and when we went to classes with eager questions on our mouths, who, why, when do you think they'll get him? And always the final thrilled question, did you know her? Did you know her? And the yes, I had an art class with her. Yes, one of my roommate's friends dated her. Yes, she asked me for a light once. Yes. This idea of the thing that people are most interested in when these kind of tragedies occur is, how close were you to the victim of the tragedy? And I find that a really fascinating little musing that he's having here as he's exploring these serial killing events.
Yeah, for sure. This strikes me as one of those things where he's taking probably some events that happened, hopefully not actual serial killer murders, but just the way people
Mm-hmm.
react to tragedies, especially ones with a kind of lurid dimension like this. I feel like he's channeling that, and it just feels very authentic.
Mm-hmm. So, Matt, we got to get to the twist ending, because this is really the thing that defines this story. And I'm curious, did you guess what this twist ending was going to be, that the whole time our narrator is actually Spring Hill Jack, the murderer? I think, going through and reading it after the twist, there are some interesting clues here as our narrator, like, over and over again, we talk about how everyone's afraid to walk alone, and people are not spending time outside, and yet our narrator keeps like going on these extended long walks through the fog and talking about how beautiful and wonderful everything is. And it there are clues here, but did you see this coming?
So the truth is, it did occur to me at a certain point in the story, and I kind of just dismissed it, because I was like, basically it's like, that's just a trope at this point. Like, It's just a trope to be like, and then it turned out that the protagonist was the killer. There are literally other Stephen King novels or stories that do this. Obviously, the first that jumps to mind is Secret Window. So the fact that it occurred to me does not mean that I'm a genius story predictor. It's just a trope.
Sure.
And then I kind of dismissed it, like I said, and I stopped thinking about it. And then the twist ending happened, and I was like, oh, okay. So it was one of those type of stories. But I don't know. Did you see it coming?
I do not remember the first time I read this one. Probably not. But this is the interesting thing about building a story around a twist, as I think this one was. And maybe this is, the exact reason why the previous story we talked about didn't end with a twist of, it was actually the kids were normal the whole time. Because I think when you build a story around a twist like this, the twist becomes the thing, right? That like this is a story that is basically about the twist.
Yeah.
And perhaps the reason why King didn't go that particular direction on Sometimes They Come Back is because he wanted the story to not just be about that twist. He wanted it to be about the trauma and the way the trauma, moves its way through this man's life.
Yeah.
And that would have gotten a little lost because your only thing you're remembering is the twist. And maybe that's why he didn't go there. And here, I mean, it works. I like it. I love the final lines of this thing where he says, "I can hear my wife as I write this in the next room crying. She thinks I was with another woman last night. And oh dear God, I think so too." That's a fun little sting of an ending there that really sells the twist of, oh, it was me the whole time. I did not see it coming, but I do enjoy it for what it is. But basically, what it means is the only thing I take away from the story at the end of the day is, oh, this is the one where there's a serial killer and then it's him.
Yeah, right. That's I think that's the thing about the previous story we just talked about. Sometimes They Come Back, where like I feel like it would have been cheapened by that kind of twist. Like it's not like I'm saying that this story is cheapened. It's just like it's and he was the killer the whole time. Okay, got it. And then you just kind of go on with your day. Like this one doesn't linger with you and upset you in the same way that Sometimes They Come Back does.
I agree.
So, yeah.
And it, again, not to disparage the story, which I like a lot, and I do appreciate when we get to see a window into King's kind of experimentation with his voice and writing, and it's why I truly love The Gunslinger. As a thing that is kind of distinctly not King-esque, but also just wonderfully written and fascinating. I think is the same thing here. I think the writing here is very good. It's just the thing that sticks with you with the story when you leave it, in my opinion, is just, that's the one where he doesn't want to check in his trunk because he thinks that the head is in there, which it is.
Yeah. I mean, so to step back, like this story, Strawberry Spring, published 1968. Sometimes They Come Back, published 1974. So that's good 6 years of growth as a writer. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Strawberry Spring was bad, but it is a more kind of young man's sense of feeling out how to write a story, right? Where it's like, it's sort of straightforward. And then the twist is sort of like, yep. And then okay, got it. Right.
Yeah.
And then 6 years later, he writes this story, which is really this much more complex, subtle, a lot is communicated, like not explicitly. It's left there for you to kind of dig at and think about.
Yeah.
Huge amount of development, actually, I would say.
No, I love that. I think you're totally right. It shows that's the fun part of doing this, right? Is we get to see that evolution. It's great. It's great, actually, seeing how a skilled writer like this can just get better. And we talk so much. Sometimes I think when people talk about good writing, they reduce it to just like the strength of the prose on a micro level. And like I think what we're talking about here, specifically with Sometimes They Come Back, is just like the strength of how you organize and structure your story to tell the most effective, complex story possible. And like, which is to say that I think the prose in Strawberry Spring is excellent. I do. I think it's very well written from a sentence structure perspective. But like how to tell a complex story effectively and efficiently and to take your character or take your readers along for the ride, I think it Sometimes They Come Back is superior to it.
Yeah. It's cool. Yeah, no, it's fun.
Yeah, and that, my friend, is our last story of the week.
All right, we did it again.
Yeah, and we're only slightly over on time, so let's get right into our discussion questions. What was the question we asked our listeners last week?
Last week we asked, what do you like most about the short story format? Do you enjoy them more or less than full-length novels, and why? So without further ado, Mark Davo says, I'm not a huge short story reader, but remember really loving one of Philip K. Dick's short story collections, as well as anthology series like Black Mirror and Inside Number 9. What I like best about the format is the fact that anything is possible. Authors can quickly establish a new piece of technology or a monster without having to go into detail about their origin. We get this pure distillation of the ramifications of an idea or premise that leaves us wanting more, allowing us the space to imagine what might happen next. Yeah, that's great. I didn't read this answer before we talked today, but I feel like we hit upon some of these ideas in our discussion today. The idea that that's what's fun about some of these stories.
Do you think that, like, there's a general idea, and we've talked about world building a lot over the past few weeks, and do you think, like, does a short story just have different rules for world building? Like, it's just, you don't have to build out your world as much because people will take more as a given in this format?
I mean, probably. Yeah. I mean, definitely in terms of expectation, I think that's fair to say. Like, you approach a medium or is medium the right word? A class, a type of art with a certain set of expectations, and those expectations can really guide how you experience things. And yeah, I think with short stories, you just don't expect that much. You don't expect a full clarity of the backstory. You can just gesture at something and have that be enough.
Yeah, I wonder if in a novel length version or a feature film length version of Trucks, if you would need to offer some sort of explanation as to how it's happening or why it's happening.
I think what you would do is you might do what they sort of started to do, where like different characters offered different explanations, but none was revealed to be definitive. I think people would expect at least that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's fair. All right, next we have Steve D, who says, short stories are great. In audiobook format, I can usually get through a story in 1 or 2 commute days. As a reader, it feels like I'm filling in more blanks about backstory, leaving more open to interpretation. Sometimes I don't want a big meal. A short story collection means I get to try a bunch of appetizers. This morning, my 7th grade son was telling me his literature class just read the short story 0 Hour by Ray Bradbury. He loved it and was excited to tell me all about it. A great conversation to start the day. Short stories are great.
Yeah. That just reminds me that I think the first short story collection that I read as a kid was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think they were way over my head because I mainly just experienced them as like collages of imagery and disturbing ideas, which is fine actually. I think it can be beneficial even as a younger person to read stuff that's out of you, where you're out of your depth. But that's great. Love that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Baby Can You Dig Your Sam says, I love short stories because anything is possible. Since you haven't spent 500 pages getting readers invested in characters, you can do anything to them. Kill them all off, twist ending, write an ending with no real resolution. You can go super dark. You can create unapologetically vile characters with no explanation as to why they became that way. This is why I've always loved a good anthology show. Whether it's Twilight Zone, Amazing Stories, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Friday the 13th, the series, Tales from the Crypt, Black Mirror, Del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, etc., etc., etc. Sometimes they're bone-chilling, sometimes they're funny, and sometimes they just don't work. But I didn't invest enough time to really care. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. And also, of course, Treehouse of Horror is another we'll add to this list.
That's great, yeah.
Can I say in my shame, I have not watched Del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities yet, which is, I think, it released on Netflix last fall. And it's just a series of short horror stories on Netflix. And there's no excuse. I love Guillermo del Toro way more than you do.
Yeah, yeah. So this is more shameful for you, but there's just too much stuff out now, though. I mean, I haven't even watched all of Black Mirror, but my excuse there is that that's actually really fucking disturbing, and you can only handle so much Black Mirror. And I'll get back to it someday, but Jesus.
Man, I haven't even finished watching Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, which is Del Toro and stop motion, which are like 2 of my favorite things in the world. And I started that movie one day and I was loving it, and then we had to go do something, and I still haven't picked it up again.
And it's almost like you don't really like Del Toro that much because he's not that good.
Shut your you shut your mouth. You shut it. I'm gonna go
You know
watch
what?
it right now. We're calling the podcast off early. I'm gonna go watch it right now.
I think I'm allowed to at least say that much, given that I did go through the whole deconstructing Del Toro experience with you.
Yeah, and you were wrong every single time.
All right,
except for those couple times you were right.
We don't have to dig up that old angry, bitter disagreement between the two of us.
We fought so much during that whole thing.
So much. Go listen on the Doofcast.
Such a lie. We didn't fight at all. Scantron93 says, Matt pretty much nailed my take, which is that short stories are best at conveying an idea and translate very well to horror. So much good horror is ruined by the explanation and resolution, when less is often more. You can see this in film with one of my favorite favorite short films, David F. Sandberg's Lights Out. It's a fun 3-minute scare with a concept that will burrow into you. It cost pennies to make and went viral. Sandberg started his film career with an 81-minute expansion, which had much less impact because it just dilutes the original scare. The monsters hiding in the darkness could be anything, and when we don't overdo the search, it becomes everything.
You've seen that one, right?
I've seen both the short and the feature-length film, and I agree completely. Not a terrible movie, but the short is just so much more effective because for every reason that Scantron says here.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen the long version, but yeah, the short is like the perfect example of the benefits of making things short. Actually, yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing that example to mind, Scantron. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Now, and if you close your eyes, Matt, you can recreate the short story in your head and give yourself nightmares.
I have to walk through my dark house to get to my bedroom, so I'm not going to do that. But thank you for
just turn all the lights on your way. It'll be fine.
Yeah. All right. Tian Bugdoc says, I enjoy both formats, but the short story is usually more suitable for a satisfying horror or sci-fi story. With a novel, I expect a good explanation for the supernatural or sci-fi elements of the plot. In a horror novel, you had better convince me that the demon summoning routine is grounded in the lore of the book and make me believe that it is something to be feared. Same with sci-fi. At novel length, I want to know how time travel or faster-than-light transport works, or that any other futurist tech is at least physically plausible. For a short story, though, I'm quite happy to suspend disbelief in the interest of a quick, enjoyable story. Need me to believe an industrial laundry machine can be possessed by a nameless demon? Sure. Boogeyman in the closet? Check. Giant rats mutating into flying legless beasts? Whatever you say. No explanation needed for these. I will take them as a given. Just give me a good story. The one-night stand analogy mentioned by another poster certainly applies. Shared core beliefs, political leanings, life aspirations, none of those matter for a one-night stand. It's all about taking each other as is and enjoying the moment. Short stories fill the same role in the literary world. That's pretty funny, actually. I like that. Okay, yeah, good answer. I like that. Yeah, I agree. Just lower expectations.
I think it's great how I think a lot of these are aligning with everything we've talked about this week and last week. This idea that there is expectation that comes with a novel that just isn't there with a short story.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's one of the things, circling back around to the answer we read before that, this idea that the least fun part of a horror movie is the part where they eventually have to explain everything to you. And they have to do that because there's an expectation with that. Whereas with the short story, you don't necessarily need that. And that is why something like Lights Out works so much better. And that is, Tien Bugdoc talking about the expectations of explanation for longer form storytelling.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's always my least favorite part of any horror movie is when they're like, and this is where the demon comes from. I'm like, oh my God, no, don't tell me. No, I don't want to know that,
Yeah. And it's interesting in the ways that, like, I don't know, like a movie like Alien, both did and didn't tell where the alien came from, right? There is lore, there is world building here, but it's vague and it's functional. So it's not like you have to fully explain everything in a longer form story. But there is more explanations there for sure.
Yeah, you're right.
Next, we have Just Stand 8460, who says, what I like best about a short story is how it doesn't get lost in a slog on slog of nothingness in the middle, or pepper the reader with gratuitous just world-building repetition, like how George R. R. Martin can help but list the entire menu of every feast, gala, soiree, or tavern in Game of Thrones series, or how Robert Jordan insists on describing clothing in every interaction, as well as hair color and bust size in the Wheel of Time series. Full-length novels can get so lost in those details at times that they begin to lose their edge and, dare I say it, entertainment value, at least for a time. What I also love about short stories is the potential for them to expand into more should the muse or Gan himself demand that there is more to tell. They can easily stand up alone or become a door into much more. However, I love being immersed in an epic, sans the gratuitous braid tugging and arm folding, but I also like to have a quick build to a big finish that has the potential to make me feel something in one sitting as opposed to over weeks. I cross my mind. I can't decide. I think for the writer, a short story allows them to workshop new concepts, ideas, styles, and voices when they are not quite ready to execute a full-length novel format yet.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's why I enjoy writing short stories much more than I enjoy writing longer stories. Is you can just try something out quickly and be like, that was fun, that was good. You're not overcommitting from the writing perspective.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with everything about just like certain kind of ticks of writers, like they're allowed to like indulge in long form fiction where you're like, okay, you couldn't have gotten away with this in a shorter piece, and now I'm just annoyed with you. Yeah, very much agree with that.
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting because the way I actually frame this conversation, because I tend to not read too many short stories actually, but the way I frame this is the difference between watching a television series and watching a movie, right? Where a movie is, in this comparison, closer to a short story than a full-length TV series is. And I do think there's value in both of them. There's value in the long-form, sprawling type storytelling that novels or TV can do. And then there's value in the quick get in and get out that a 90-minute film can do. I like Just Stan's answer because I think I'm kind of in the same boat of I think there's benefits to both of them and they suit my needs differently.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, that's the thing is, despite the fact that I'm probably sounding really glowing about short stories as a medium, I read very few short stories actually. I despite the fact that I know that I always enjoy it when I buy short story anthologies, I don't ever do that actually. Nobody to blame but myself here, and I think it's just like there's an allure to a long novel or a series of novels where it's like you're gonna go into this world and you're just gonna get so immersed and you're gonna fall in love with it, and these characters are gonna be people to you, right? Like there's no short story that has a character that resonates with you the way that Eddie Dean resonates with you after multiple books. It's just impossible. So there's obvious differences and trade-offs
for sure.
All right. Jen Cat D says, I am a doorstop novel fan. I like the big boys. I want so much character development that I grieve the loss of my besties when the book ends. That being said, short stories always scare me more. I know you're going to laugh at me, but The Mangler gave me Sleepless Night, where I had to close the curtain to avoid seeing the maniacal machine lurching up my front walk. I could see the bits of concrete floor stuck to the bolts where it pulled free. Shiver.
I'm not going to laugh at you about that because I think everyone has things that scare them.
Yeah.
I think honestly the greatest part of The Mangler as a story to me was that it's fucking hilarious, but also kind of creepy at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most, I think maybe the only time I ever literally had a sleepless night about a scary thing was a comic book, which is interestingly at the intersection of written and visual medium. But it was about the X-Man Sabretooth. And you know how sometimes comic books can be like really horribly violent and awful? It was one of those. And I was way too young to have read it. But, comic books, it's a comic book, Scott. So, of course, it's just... Anyway, I was so scared that Sabretooth was like right there, He was like right there. He was like, that was right Sabretooth standing in the doorway. That shape was Sabretooth. Anyway, that's a tangent, but totally get it. You can be scared of things where later you look back on it and you're like, really? But yeah, it's true.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Next, we have E-Man 9001, and he's got our much awaited one night stand metaphor here. For me, the difference between a short story and a novel is the difference between a one-night stand and a long-term relationship. Both have a special place in my heart. With a novel, you have a commitment. You are going to sit with these characters and themes and get to know them over an extended period of time. You have 500 or so pages to let the story set in slowly. Get to know the author's prose, see the theme supported again and again. When it ends, a small part of you is sad it's over and not sure how to move on to your next book. With a short story, you crack open the book and the author hits you hard. Every sentence purposeful. Your time with the book is short, and the author here is here to pound the themes into your brain in the next 50 pages and then leave your life forever as you move on to your next bibliophilic experience. It ends in a huff almost as quickly as it began. Overall, I prefer the time a novel takes to really let me explore the story. I usually will have a deeper connection with a novel than a short story. The only exception that comes to mind is N by Stephen King. That being said, I just got out of a long-term relationship with The Outsider, and Mr. Harrigan's phone is calling my name from across the bookshelf.
That's great.
Oh, I love that answer so much.
Thank you for originating that metaphor. It's fantastic.
Yes. That's quite delightful.
And I agree. All right, next from Pear Jane. Stephen King said it best. A short story is like a kiss in the dark. It's unexpected, brief, titillating. And even if it's not that great, the darkness and brevity mean it still feels good. A kiss in the dark doesn't always have to be great, but as long as it's not sloppy or terrible, it's usually good enough to want one more taste. Yeah, that's great.
Everything's a sex metaphor, actually, when you think about it.
He didn't mention corn at all, but I still believe that it was probably Stephen King.
Short stories are like a good husk of corn.
Good. Sink your teeth into that corn. Feel those juices squirt all over your chin.
Jesus Christ.
Talking about corn, Scott. What are you thinking about?
It's too late. It's too late at night to be dealing with you pretending like you're fucking corn.
It's not about me. Anyway.
All right, Matt, what is our question for the listeners next week?
Next week, we are asking, what is your favorite killer machine?
Is it a truck? Is it the Mangler? Is it something other thing?
Yeah, we had a couple weeks.
Is it Megan?
Is it Megan? Yeah.
Would Megan count as a killer machine?
Yeah. I assume Terminator would count as a killer machine.
Terminator is the killer machine.
Yeah. So yeah, you gotta tell us. There's all kinds out there.
My choice is going to be that Psycho Optimus Prime.
Yes, he is. He is the greatest villain in modern cinema.
So yeah, let us know what's yours. Believe it or not, folks, it's hard to come up with discussion questions that encapsulate everything that these episodes entail, because there's 5 completely different stories. So we're gonna have to get a little creative over these next few weeks, and this is attempt 1 at that creativity. So I hope you enjoy it.
Have fun with it.
Yeah. And that is going to do it for us this week. Next week, Night Shift continues with 4 more stories. We're going to be reading and discussing The Ledge, The Lawnmower Man, Quitters Inc., and I Know What You Need. Matt, any thoughts about these titles? Are they titillating?
They are titillating. Some of them I feel like I might vaguely know what the direct. I mean, The Lawnmower Man, I kind of know. Well, okay.
Oh, do you? Oh, do you?
Honestly, probably totally misleading if I go by the movie. So anyway, no, I guess I don't know much about these really, ultimately. But I'm excited nonetheless. Cool titles. He's good at titles.
Yeah, these titles are good. I wonder. I assume with stories like this, he does come up with the titles himself, because he's got to have a title when he submits them to these magazines originally. So.
Yeah, I think typically the author chooses the title. I don't actually know. It's a good question. Anyway, remember, you can reach us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com, or you can reach us over on Twitter at kingslingerspod, or you can head on over to the subreddit r/doofmedia and comment in the thread associated with this episode, or just hang out and chat with people.
That is right. And make sure you subscribe. We are located on YouTube and pretty much any other podcasting platform that exists out there. So if you are listening to this and have not subscribed for whatever reason, please do so right away. You don't want to miss Matt reacting to the Lawnmower Man next week. You don't want to miss it.
No, you don't. And if you like any of our shows and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia. Special thanks this week to new patrons Brendan C., Heidi B., Trisha C., and Walter C. Welcome, and we hope you enjoy the cool bonus stuff we got over there on the Patreon.
Yeah, including our episode on Creepshow, available now, which is available to all patrons because I screwed up. So I hope you enjoy it, everyone.
Yeah, if you enjoy it, consider signing up for the higher tier.
I could have just pulled it and reposted it, but I felt like it was my mistake, and
it was too late.
Just going to have to live with it.
Gonna have to live with it.
Yeah. Of course, if you cannot afford to support us on Patreon, that is absolutely okay. There's, as always, tons of ways to help us out. You can share the podcast on social media, on Reddit, on, I don't know, wherever else the kids go these days. TikTok. Does anyone talk about us on TikTok?
Probably.
Let us know. Send me your TikToks.
Send me your TikToks. I don't do TikTok. That's my one thing that I've managed to resist.
I'm proud of you. I'm very proud of you. You do way more Twitter than I do, though. I don't know if that's better.
No, you shouldn't really be proud of me, honestly. No one should be proud of me.
All right, folks, that's going to do it for us this week. We will be back next week with 4 more night shift stories. I can't wait. There's some fun ones. We'll see you then. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.